For coming this evening to Berkeley City College. I'm Dr. Debbie Budd, the president here at Berkeley City College. Well, this is the fifth of our speaker series event with the Math Science Research Institute. And in a few moments, I will introduce the director, Dr. David Eisenbud of the MSRI Institute, who will introduce our speaker, Eugenie Scott, speaking of science denialism. When you came in this evening, I hope you each received one of our brochures that we're so proud of. If it's your first time, I just wanted to share a little bit about Berkeley City College. We are really proud of the work we do for our over 7,000 students every term in helping them with foundational skills, with career technical education, and with transfer to four-year universities. Just today, hot off the press, we found out that Berkeley City College is number one of the 112 colleges in the acceptance rate to UC Berkeley. It's very exciting. The state average is about 24%. We're at 63% of our students that apply that get accepted, and we're very, very proud of that. And we think it's a lot because of the partnerships we have with our high schools and the universities, and I think this speaker series speaks right to that. In here you can see we talk a little bit about exploring, connecting, and excelling, and we've just highlighted it here. 3 of our students, one who just recently won an Emmy Award, one that's in our biotechnology program that is now working in pharmacy with a large company, as well as a story of our students that come with many challenges that then are successful and move on. So we'd be happy to give you a tour of the campus if it's your first time. Please give us a call from the numbers on the brochure, and we'll be happy to set that up. And we welcome you to our next event that will be in April 9th of our speaker series. So thank you for coming. And without any further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. David Eisenbud.
Eugenie Scott has made a reputation and a career of doing the work that we all need done, protecting the education system in a very basic way against the people who want to prevent the teaching of science. Mathematics isn't usually in need of this protection, perhaps least so among all the sciences. It flourished even in Stalinist Russia because it was a little outside. On the other hand, I was thinking we do need it sometimes. There are plenty of toxic misconceptions about mathematics, though not usually in the legislature. But there are some, for example, the famous incident in which the state of Kansas tried to legislate the value of pi. We could have used Eugenie's work at that time. Eugenie Scott has been the executive director of the National Center for Science Education from '87 to 2014, written several books on topics related to science denialism, on creationism, on intelligent design and their misuses. She served as president of the American Association of Physical Anthropologists, too. She has many awards. It seems to me that this is one of those things which is easy to recognize that she's doing the right thing for all of us, but I don't know if that translates into funding. Perhaps we'll find out from her. She has a AAAS award for scientific freedom and responsibility. She was named by the Scientific American as one of the 10 outstanding leaders involved in research, business, or policy pursuits that have advanced science and technology. She holds 9 honorary degrees. She was awarded the University Medal from the University of California, San Francisco, and there are many more on my sheet. But I'd much rather listen to Dr. Scott's stories than to my introduction, so I'm going to stop here.
Well, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. I've attended other sessions here at the MSRI speaker series, and I'm honored to have been included as one of them. So, could we do something about the brightness of the lights on these slides? Can we? Much better, yeah. You don't need to see me, but you do need to see that. So, all right. The people who deny science. I'm going to talk about climate change and evolution denial. So what do these organizations have to do with these organizations? Well, they differ in a number of ways. For starters, the ones on the bottom have a lot more members. The ones on the top have a lot more money, and they have a lot more political and influence. But personnel from, people associated with the top group propose various forms of climate change denial. Personnel from the bottom group deny that living things share common ancestors in preference to the idea that everything was created in essentially its present form. Yet both climate change and evolution are well accepted in the scientific community, not just in the United States, but internationally. I want to talk about these two so-called controversial issues because outside of the universities and the research institutions, they are. Hello, I don't know why we're doing that, but let's try this. Like all things, there are nuances of differences among those who reject evolution and those who reject climate change. Collecting and interpreting poll data, survey research data on evolution is very complicated. Rarely are the questions broken down to distinguish among these differences. But roughly speaking, the strongest position is that nothing evolves. Everything was specially created in its present form and in the most common form of creationism over a period of fewer than 10,000 years, special creation. A somewhat less strict form is to accept that the physical universe evolves, but not living things. So it's okay for galaxies and stars and the physical universe. It's okay for the planet Earth to have had an evolutionary history, shall we say. But once you get to living things, that's where the heels get dug in. And then the least severe form, but not at all uncommon, is the idea that, well, yes, everything evolves except humans. And that is a position, we have encountered all of these positions at the National Center for Science Education. So like I say, the survey research data doesn't do a very good job breaking down these nuances of differences. But what data we have shows that the attitude toward evolution has been depressingly consistent for at least 30 years or so. The top line is the reference to, do we get that? We didn't get that. The idea that humans are specially created in their present form, and that generally comes to the mid to high 40% of American citizens. The middle line is the idea that humans evolved, but God was not involved. And this is about 10 or 12% of American citizens. Higher numbers can be found for the acceptance of evolution the middle line is humans evolved, but it's guided by God, and that's mid to high 30%. The bottom line, humans evolved, God is not involved, and that's 10 to 12%. So if you add up the God-guided evolution as well as the unguided evolution, it's roughly 50%, slightly smaller than that, of the American population, but rarely do the numbers get any higher than 50%. Similarly, global warming rejection takes several forms also. The strongest is just to deny that it's getting warmer at all. It's just flat not getting warmer. It's a fluctuation. Any warm years that we have is merely a process of the variation of the planet changing over time. Whether global warming is anthropogenic is particularly contentious. The idea that, yes, it's getting warmer, but it's not us. It's just natural causes. The third perspective is kind of an interesting one that one does encounter. Yes, it's getting warmer. Yes, people are responsible. It is anthropogenic, but there's nothing we can do about it. We can only accommodate to the future planet, which is warming, rather than try to prevent any sort of disaster. Now, I want you to think about these three statements, because the first two really are scientific claims. Either the planet is getting warmer or it's not getting warmer. Either it's anthropogenic or it's not. Those are claims that can be tested and they can be supported or they can be refuted. The third is not really a scientific question. The third is more a policy issue. If there is climate change, if any, what should we do about it? What should we do about it if we do anything? And what we find is that it's the consequences of climate change, it's the consequences of evolution that cause people to reject it, not the science per se. And I'll try to develop that as I go along this hour. Now, data from the Pew Foundation suggests that Americans are more aware that Earth is getting warm than that humans bear responsibility. The top line, if you can, I think that's a fairly bright slide. Yes, there's solid evidence the world is warming. The most recent data from 2012, shown here, 67%, but the idea that human activity is very much responsible for that is a much lower percentage, in the low 40s. And yet the agreement of scientists on the reality of evolution is quite impressive. And almost as impressive is the agreement of scientists about human-caused global warming. So clearly there's a gap between the views of scientists and the views of those of the general public. And I'd like to suggest some ways that we can consider this disconnect between the understandings of the scientific community and the understandings of the general public, and suggest some of the ways that we might start to cope with this, because I don't think it's a healthy thing for our society to have the public that much at odd angles, shall we say, from what scientists have demonstrated quite clearly as reality. At the National Center for Science Education, we find that we can group the strategies used by either evolution or climate change deniers into three pillars of denial, as we call them. The first pillar is to question the science. The science is weak, scientists are abandoning the disciplines of evolution or climate change, and there's been a very, very long history, of course, of questioning the science of evolution. You can go back further than 1935, but Harry Rimmer just is so wonderful. I just had to bring you this quotation here. The chain of evidence that purports to support the theory of evolution is a chain indeed, but its links are formed of sand and mist. Analyze the evidence and it melts away. Turn the light of true investigation upon its demonstrations, and they fade like fog before the freshening breeze. We just don't write that way anymore. What can I say? And of course, more recent evaluations of the scientific evidence of evolution is certainly abundant. We have here Ronald Reagan's considerations here that evolution is a weak scientific idea. In 1988, Luther Sunderland also concurred that leading scientists are abandoning evolution, and we all know in 2000, the President of the United States similarly questioned whether evolution was a valid scientific idea. And we even have more recently than that, the Republican candidates, raise your hand if you do not believe in evolution. Yes, some of us remember that. So let's talk a little bit about questioning the science. Let's talk about the strategy of challenging the science of evolution and of climate change. Now, one of the common ways of questioning the science is to claim that there are scientists who deny the consensus. Tobacco companies, creationists, global warming deniers all have used this approach very effectively. The Discovery Institute has its lists of scientists doubting Darwinism. The Oregon Institute of Science and Medicine, which is sounds like a quite mighty group, but it's a very small organization run by a man named Arthur Robinson and his sons, has a very impressive sounding 30,000 plus scientists on their equivalent petition questioning the science of global warming. On the other hand, if you really take a close look at either of these lists, you perhaps begin to question whether you are really learning much about the scientific views of these two subjects. The Oregon petition in particular reflects a quite random list of sciences, including medicine, engineering, veterinary medicine, agriculture, computer science, and even a few climate scientists, but not very many. The largest category, about 10,000 of these 30,000 signatories, is general science. Plus, Signatories only had to have a bachelor's degree or higher in order to qualify, which, considering the size of the United States and how many people have graduated from college with bachelor's degrees in science since about 1970, which would be, include people like me, and people who would be in the cohort of eligible signatories of this petition, that's only about 0.3% of the scientific community. So even 30,000 people is not a terribly impressive number. And that, of course, is the thing to remember about these claims of substantial numbers of scientists doubting either evolution or climate change. The number of scientists on the other side is minuscule compared to the number accepting either evolution or climate change. The public tends to hear the media's commitment to balance, which is a legitimate journalistic ethic of presenting all sides of an argument, but it fails when you present it as implying that the two sides have equal weight. And this is I'm all in favor of journalistic balance. When I travel, when I get in the hotel room, as a matter of just public responsibility, I watch Fox News. All right. I like balance in journalism. We have plenty of examples of imbalance in journalism. But the balance should not be presented as if there is equal numbers of scientists on both sides. Lawyers have a somewhat cynical statement about expert witnesses. For every PhD, there is an equal and opposite PhD. And unfortunately, many citizens seem to feel the same way. If there are scientists denying evolution, then the jury is still out. So it's Richard Dawkins versus Michael Behe. Yet, for every PhD, there is not an equal and opposite PhD. When you look at the number of scientists over there on the evolution side and the number of scientists on the anti-evolution side, it certainly is a disproportionate listing. Similarly, for climate science, it's Michael Mann versus Richard Lindzen. Yet for every PhD, there is not an equal and opposite PhD. The percentage of scientists doubting global warming is a very tiny percentage of scientists as a whole, and it is especially a small percentage, of the scientists who are climate scientists, who of course are the ones who are most qualified to speak most authoritatively. Now there are many other ways. Oh, by the way, Steve, would you mind standing up, please? We have a Steve shirt. That's you, sir. Would you mind standing up? Oh, I'm sorry, that's an Ooze shirt. He's wearing an NCSE t-shirt, but from a distance in my old presbyopic eyes, I was thinking he was wearing a Steve shirt, but he isn't. As a way of poking fun of creationists who make lists about scientists denying Darwin, a number of years ago, the NCSE decided that we would give them a little elbow in the ribs, so to speak, because we thought this was a dumb idea to have lists of scientists in favor or against any scientific idea. That's not the way you do science, right? So they had 100 scientists doubting Darwin. So we got 200 scientists to attest to a statement about evolution is very important. Natural selection is an important mechanism. You shouldn't teach creationism. Very nice little sentence, a couple sentences about evolution. And we got 200, twice as many scientists as they did. But all of our scientists were named Steve. Okay. So Project Steve has been a wonderful success. The Discovery Institute now has something like 800, I think the 800 and change scientists doubting Darwin. We inducted the Kilo Steve a couple of years ago, and I think we're now up to 1,200 plus Steves, so it's been a lot of fun. But the point is, it doesn't matter how many scientists you have signing a statement. What matters is, does the theory explain nature? And it does. Attacking the integrity of scientists is another tried and true way of questioning the science. Shoot the messenger. Perhaps the best example of this from climate science is the fuss over leaked University of East Anglia emails, ClimateGate, as it was referred to, from 2009 and following. Scientists were talking to each other over a period of several years using the typical shorthand that one often uses when one uses email. ladies and gentlemen, how many people here use email? Oh, there are a few. Keep your hands up. Keep your hands up. Don't worry, I won't call on you. You're safe. But come, there you go. Keep your hands up. You use email. How many of you, keep your hand up if you have never sent any email that you wish you hadn't? There are some noble people here, but not a lot. Okay, so we've all been there, right? Okay. So these were private emails among friends and colleagues. Yeah, a couple of things were said that might have hurt the feelings of the person who was being spoken of, right? But in ClimateGate, there was an awful lot of these emails, phrases and sentences and chunks and pieces of these emails that were taken completely out of context and held up to imply that these are venal people. These are people who are fudging the data to push a political agenda and, of course, to keep the big bucks rolling in. We all know that scientific research is a get-rich-quick scheme. I do want to call your attention to the fact that about a half a dozen investigative agencies, including governmental ones both here and in the and in Great Britain, and academies of science, including our own National Academy of Science, have investigated to see whether research fraud has been identified within the ClimateGate emails, and no one has found anything that is not within the bounds of acceptable science. Yeah, people were a little snarky. I won't ask you to raise your hand if you've never sent a snarky email, but one doesn't. Let me just give you an example of taking things out of context, twisting them to cast a very negative light on the scientists themselves. An example is UC Berkeley physicist Rich Muller's accusation. A quote came out of the emails, these leaked emails that said, "Let's use Mike's trick to hide the decline." That's the words, "Let's use Mike's trick to hide the decline." Now, others have contended that because the work of Jones et al. Is included in the IPCC documents, therefore the documents themselves are called into question, and that therefore the IPCC climate change evaluating documents are to be discarded, and climate change is a lie. Actually, there was no collusion, but the reputations of competent scientists have been unjustly smeared. It's worth taking a little time to unpack this. First, let's take a look at the full quote. The full quote is from Phil Jones. "I've just completed Mike's nature trick of adding in the real temps to each series for the last 20 years, from 1981 onwards, and from 1961 for Keith's to hide the decline." What does this mean anyway? Well, what was this email about? It wasn't about the IPCC or even about climate change per se. It was about Phil Jones's preparation of the cover for a non-academic magazine being prepared for the general public, the World Meteorological Organization. Now, many of us have presented our scientific results to the public. You simplify. You try, especially for a cover graphic, you want to get something that's punchy, that expresses your idea without a lot of clutter. That's just normal publication. There are thermometer measurements only from 1850 to the present. The rest of the data in surveys like this are proxy data, which are derived from tree rings, from corals, lake sediments, et cetera. They're indirect measures. So what is Mike's nature trick? Mike's nature trick was used by Mike Mann in his 1999 Nature article on Northern Hemisphere temperatures. He used estimated or proxy data from periods where there were no direct measurements, but from the 1800s on, where there are actual thermometer readings. He overlaid the proxy data, see the arrow there in the red? He overlaid the proxy data on the actual thermometer measurements. The trick is to increase the accuracy of the data reporting. This doesn't sound terribly nefarious. So Mike's nature trick is like in tricks of the trade. It's also separate from hide the decline. What does hide the decline refer to? Jones is reporting on Keith Briffa's data on dendrochronology, which generally tracked temperature reliably from about 1850 on, but not perfectly. For some northern boreal forest trees, not all parts of the world, but some North American trees, there is an anomalous difference in the measured temperature and the tree rings temperature from about 1960 on, where this arrow shows. Hence, Jones, for the purposes of this general reader magazine, was correcting the anomalous proxy data by substituting in real temperature measurements, Mike's nature trick. In the actual IPCC reports, all of this is spelled out in full, unlike in a general reader publication. And in any event, the decline is not a temperature decline, but a decline in the quality of the data. And you can decide for yourself whether this warrants criminal investigation, as was raised against Michael Mann by the Virginia Attorney General. So, attacking the integrity of scientists is one of the tools of the trade, shall we say, in the attack on the science. A classic approach for challenging the science is to cherry-pick the data, find an apparent anomaly, and thereby reject the science. Most of the young Earth creationist arguments against the age of the Earth are like this one. By the way, this is from a Jack T. Chick comic book called Primal Man. Many of you have seen the Jack Chick Big Daddy comic. You know, he makes these little pamphlets. They're all over the place. I love creationist comic books. They are the only comic books on the planet in which you have footnotes, number one. How many comic books have footnotes? But footnotes especially to the scientific literature. I mean, what's not to like about this? Yeah. Spider-Man, eat your heart out. What can I say? Okay, so what is this? This is a little scene within the Primal Man comic book. You don't need to know the plot of it, but anyway, this fellow is being challenged. His evolutionary views are being challenged. Lava rocks were checked in Hawaii by potassium argon, said they were 3 billion years old. Well, then that's where the volcano erupted. No, it erupted in 1801, asterisk, footnote. Okay, well, if you actually go to see the article by Funkhauser et al., the article is quite clear that indeed, if you take a sample from this observed volcano in Hawaii, which was observed to erupt in 1801, you get an anomalous date. And the reason you get an anomalous date is because the lava is bringing up these specific kinds of rock formation from very, very deep in the mantle, which are inclusions in the lava itself, which is of a different kind of rock. So if you date the lava flow and you don't purify your sample, you could be dating one of these really, really ancient olivine crystals from deep in the mantle. So what this article is all about is not an attack on the validity of potassium argon dating. It's how you can do it so you don't make mistakes. But you wouldn't necessarily pick this up from Primal Man. One of my favorite examples of cherry picking of data from climate change deniers has to do with Arctic sea ice melting. Now, this is a matter that climate scientists are quite concerned about because the melting of the Arctic is an indication of oceanic heating, and oceanic heating is very important because changes in oceanic ecosystems with resulting effects on fisheries, coral reefs, the jet stream. One interesting hypothesis being floated about is that polar warming has caused the jet stream to become wavier, which is possibly responsible for some of the incredibly severe weather that's being experienced in the Middle West and in the East Coast. So that's still being tested, but it's a very interesting idea, and there's some evidence to support it. So Joseph Bast is the president of the Heartland Institute, and he writes that National Snow and Ice Data Center records show conclusively in April 2009, Arctic sea ice extent had returned to and surpassed 89 levels. Well, so it sounds like the Arctic isn't melting. It sounds like this is just a fluctuation, just a natural kind of thing. No worries. Well, when you look at the 1989 data, which is the blue line, and the 2009 data, a decade later, the red line there, it's apparent that there's less Arctic ice 10 years later. Down at the x-axis there is January, February, March, April. This is months of the year, and of course the amount of polar ice is going to fluctuate during the year. But, you know, really, if you look at, gosh, it doesn't look like there's been a refreezing of the Arctic. Oh, wait, there is 1 month in which the lines cross. That happens to be the month of April, which is the month that Mr. Bass chose to cherry pick out of the rest of the data. And certainly the data are very clear that from 79 to 2013, the overall amount of Arctic ice has indeed receded regardless of what happens in any given month or year. Climate contrarian Joseph DeLeo posted this graph on a popular anti-global warming site to illustrate the temperatures in the Arctic fluctuate at about a 60 to 70 degree cycle. Thus, anthropogenic global warming isn't a worry. The current warming is just a natural phenomenon. And he points out that the 1940s are as warm or warmer than the present. Listed on the upper left are the sites that are used, and there are 6 sites, mostly in Scandinavia. Well, looking at that line, it kind of doesn't look like there's this great crisis in polar melting, does it? It does look kind of like a fluctuation. It's going to be getting colder again, and, you know, nothing to worry about. Well, the climate blog site Open Minds did an analysis of this claim, finding, again, substantial cherry picking. It happens there are, in fact, 137 GHCN data collection sites. You see those black dots all over the place? Here are the 6 sites chosen by Dr. DeLeo. One might say this is inadequate, not only in number. It's 4 of 137 sites, but in the distribution of the sites around the Arctic. If you look at the whole series, rather than just cherry-picking 4% of the data, you get a rather different story. When all of the data points are presented, there's no evidence that the 1940s are warmer than today. In fact, it looks as if the 21st century is considerably warmer than any other previous period. And perhaps more important in the present-day comparison, there's no obvious cyclical pattern to warming and cooling. But you know, one of the nice things about science is replication. And one of the really wonderful things about climate science in the last 15 plus years is that we can replicate these kinds of temperature data with other kinds of measurements, such as, for example, the satellite data from NASA. And if we compare the GHCN data with the NASA data, we show virtually the same pattern. It's warmer now. And there's no obvious cyclicity to the current warming that we are experiencing in the Arctic. It certainly appears as if this is a classic case of cherry-picking the data on the part of a climate contrarian. But of course, one of the problems that you have when you're trying to deal with this idea of climate change is that people confuse climate and weather. That seems like a very obvious thing when it's pointed out to you, but for most of the people in the public, you need to point it out to them. Weather is what you experience. Climate is what you infer over a long period of time. I want to show you kind of a nice little illustration of this.
A common mistake when interpreting statistics is to look at them from too short a distance. This can make everything unclear and confusing. So forget the details and take a step back. You're looking at the dog when you should be concentrating on the owner. As you can see, the dog is all over the place, leaping and bouncing, sometimes upwards, sometimes downwards. But where do you think it will be in 10 seconds' time? Around here, right? But at this moment, the dog is on its way downwards. So why do you think it will find itself up there? It's because you noticed the owner. The owner is the trend, and it's he who determines where they both will be in a while as a bit longer than a couple of dog pounds. He could change direction. There's a lot we don't know about this guy, but everything we do know indicates he's heading in that direction. The owner is the long-term trend. The dog is the variation around this trend. Or the owner is the climate, the dog is the weather.
I like that. This is from a Swedish group, I thought that was a rather good job myself. Okay, climate is not weather. The climate is changing, the weather fluctuates. And unfortunately, some of the survey research that we have on people's acceptance or rejection of climate change shows that their immediate experience colors how they colors their answer to the question. If they've just seen some examples of thigh-high snow in Washington, D.C., they tend to reject climate change. We had a couple of warm summers a couple years ago. The percentage of American public accepting the idea that the planet was getting warmer bounced up. It'll be very interesting to see what the survey research show this coming late spring and summer after the very, very bitter cold winter that we've had. All right, let's move on to the second pillar of denial, the first being the science pillar. The second is an ideological pillar. The idea that if you accept the particular ideology, if you accept the science, you have to give up an important position. In the case of of evolution, the motivator certainly is religious. If you accept evolution, you have to give up your faith. For climate change, the situation is a little more complicated, but it's not primarily or even mainly religious. The ideological motivation is political and/or economic. Let me clarify a little bit some confusion between political and religious conservatism. Now, religious conservatives hold certain religious views. They hold the inerrancy of the Bible, a personal relationship with Jesus for salvation. They call themselves evangelicals, fundamentalists, charismatics. They prefer the term conservative Christian, which is what I will call them. Political conservatives, on the other hand, express confidence in capitalism as an economic system. They oppose taxation. They express belief in minimal government. Individuality and personal liberty is elevated to a very high state. And this is combined with confidence in the American myth of the potential for everyone to succeed based on their own efforts. Now, not all conservative Christians are political conservatives. The overlap of conservative Christians and political Christians are what is called the religious right. Not all conservative Christians are political conservatives. Some of the most energetic workers for the poor and disadvantaged are social gospel evangelicals. Not all political conservatives are religious conservatives. They don't belong to denominations that are biblically literalist, or they just aren't especially interested in religion. And the intersection, of course, is known as the religious right. Now, this diagram is relevant to both of the controversies I want to talk about today. If we overlay anti-evolutionism in this diagram, it's clear that most anti-evolutionists are conservative Christians, and anti-evolutionists reliably include the religious right because the religious right are conservative Christians. Notably, not all evangelical Christians are creationists. We have a fairly strong and very active contingent of evangelical Christians who accept evolution, and they are our best ambassadors at NCSE to reach out to their fellow believers. When a political conservative is also an anti-evolutionist, it's mostly because he or she is also a conservative Christian. In other words, a member of the religious right, not a political conservative per se. Knowing somebody is an anti-evolutionist is a good predictor of that person being a conservative Christian, less good a predictor of that person being a political conservative. Well, what's the situation with global warming? With climate change, the main engine is political conservatism. The religious right, again, are reliably climate change contrarians, but because they're politically conservative, not because they're religiously conservative. There is a substantial group of green Christians who are environmentalists. They favor creation care or stewardship theology rather than dominion theology, and they are outside of the anti-global warming movement. So ideologically, So ideologically, climate change contrarians are politically conservative rather than religiously conservative per se. Now, there's a little slice of the climate change contrarians who are where they are for religious reasons, but it tends to be dwarfed by the number who oppose climate change for political reasons. It's a providential kind of theology, the idea that God created the universe and the planet for human beings. He would never let anything bad happen to the planet. And it is merely human hubris to think that our puny actions could affect God's creation. So some anti-climate change contrarians do so for religious reasons, but that's a tiny, tiny slice. The vast majority of them object to the science of global warming because they are politically conservative. And for a variety of reasons, which I'll get into in a moment, political conservatism may find climate change to be a difficult topic. Now, there's one additional component to the composition of global warming contrarians, and this is an economic ideology, libertarian economics. Now, libertarians are a somewhat odd group politically, as they share some interests with political liberals and some with political conservatives. Like conservatives, they are strongly anti-big government. There's a very strong libertarian streak in the Tea Party, and strongly support individual self-reliance. But like political liberals, they value personal autonomy, and they support such things as legalization of marijuana, abortion rights, gay marriage, and the like. The key characteristic of libertarianism, however, is what George Soros has called free market fundamentalism, a great confidence in the power of the free market, essentially laissez-faire capitalism, to solve all economic and social issues. Many libertarians object to global warming because they believe it to be a socialist attack on capitalism. As do political conservatives, they strongly object to cap and trade or carbon tax policies or any restraints on the carbon-producing industries of coal, oil, and gas in the interest of letting the free market do its thing. So there are indeed many ideological motivations for rejecting the idea of climate change, religious, economic, and political, with the religiously motivated the smallest part of this movement. But what is very important to realize is that none of these communities is monolithic, not the religion, political, or economic ideological communities. There's variation among political conservatives regarding climate change, with acceptance of climate change being higher among moderate and liberal Republicans versus conservative Republicans. Similarly, past Republican EPA administrators took out an ad in the New York Times last August in support of human-caused global warming. So even though I'm generalizing about these ideological views, please realize that they mask considerable variation. The same thing, of course, holds for conservative religious views on evolution. There are evangelicals who accept evolution. Understanding the ideology pillar means understanding dichotomous thinking, which is rampant in both the evolution and climate change issues. In evolution, you supposedly have to choose between faith and science. But the issue isn't science, but about the consequences of evolution. Conservative Christians believe that if evolution is true, then one loses salvation, one has no motivation to be good, society will suffer because the Bible is false. Actually, that dichotomy is false. There are many intermediate positions within Christian theology between creation and evolution. And these intermediate positions are held by actually the vast majority of American Christians, Catholics and mainstream Protestants. More information on this can be found at ncse.com evolution if you're curious about this. Similarly, with climate change, there's a false dichotomy that one cannot be a political conservative unless one rejects global warming. You have to choose. Unfortunately, I've been reading lately that this may be becoming more of a litmus test for Republicans than is really, I think, healthy. But again, what is going on is not a discussion about science, but about the implications of climate change. Political conservatives believe that if climate change is true, then we are in danger of the establishment of socialism, as we'll have to restrict carbon-producing industries and thus free enterprise. We will lose our personal freedoms as big government will be telling us what kind of cars and light bulbs to buy. We face financial ruin as energy costs skyrocket. renewables being more expensive than coal, gas, and oil. And they also believe that we are endangering our national security by weakening the reliable carbon-based sources of energy on which we have traditionally depended. There is also a continuum, though, between political and economic views. And the continuum here really is intervention versus laissez-faire. The issue less is whether climate change is taking place than what to do about it, if anything. It's a policy issue, but one's view of policy reflects one's ideology. Political liberals tend to be more toward the intervention side, conservatives toward the laissez-faire side. But the point being that there are many, many intermediate positions, which should be the subject of public debate, not the science. At the National Center for Science Education, we hold that students should be taught the science so that they have a good foundation to make these policy decisions, to be participants in a society that needs to make some decisions about these issues. We don't take a position on where you should be on these continua, but we do support very strongly that an honest portrayal of the science is what is necessary in the public schools, or any school. Okay, the third pillar of denial, it's a cultural pillar. It's the claim that out of a sense of fairness or balance and to avoid dogma, both sides must be heard. In the educational setting, a version often heard is a need for critical thinking. Students should be taught evidence for and evidence against evolution, for example. Now, the cultural pillar, in some respects, is the most difficult challenge that we have, because it taps into values that virtually every American holds. Freedom of speech, giving voice to all opinions, and so forth. These are worth fighting for. They are important cultural values. I certainly support them. I hope you do as well. But balance, fairness, and so forth are essentially irrelevant when it comes to science. They are extraordinarily relevant and very important in civic society when it comes to opinions. We need to be able to express our opinions on these issues, and one's opinions should not be restricted. But science is not about opinion. Ultimately, Daniel Patrick Moynihan was right. People's opinions are different from facts. Ideas like evolution and climate change that are accepted by the scientific community are accepted because they're not just opinions. They've gone through a rigorous process of sifting and winnowing of ideas, testing and discarding the ones that don't explain nature, tentatively accepting the ones that do, rinse and repeat. Finally, an agreement solidifies around an explanation and scientists move on. Heliocentrism is here to stay. And so is evolution, and so is the fact that CO2 is a warming gas and that we have been pumping extraordinary quantities of it into the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution. These are not opinions. Ultimately, though, it's not about the science. Evolution and climate change deniers are not at all likely to change their opinions, only if presented with more scientific data. The science is necessary, but not sufficient. This is because denialism is rooted primarily in ideology and culture, and these are not easily changed, certainly not by just shoveling on more facts. There is sufficient research to suggest that people happily reject factual information if it disagrees with their preconceptions or strongly held views. In other words, if the factual information, if the science disagrees with their strongly felt ideological positions. Motivated reasoning is one term for this area of research. The science is not going to be listened to if people have their fingers jammed in their ears. And what keeps the fingers jammed in the ears is the belief that something very important is going to be lost if the other guy is right. To anti-evolutionists, again, if evolution is true, the consequences are stupendous. They believe they have to give up their belief in God and the truth of the Bible, which means loss of salvation, loss of a center for morality and behavior, loss of friends and social support. Everything crashes and burns if evolution is true. There's strong motivation to not accept it. For climate change contrarians, they believe that the global warming alarmists will weaken the economy, they'll harm national security, and require compromises in individual liberty. These are very important values that people hold, and they are not going to be shaken merely by the presentation of more scientific data. If the concerns are not assuaged, all the science in the world won't be convincing. Excuse me. So what do you do about it? Well, people have to talk to each other. What the literature shows, and really even what your personal experience shows, I imagine, is that people will change their ideas if the message doesn't challenge the ideological views too strongly, and if the information is coming from a trusted source. You have to become a trusted source. Now, the good thing about science is that scientists already have very good press. There's plenty of survey research to show that most people would go to a scientist to find out about climate change. This is a good thing. This is on our side. Unfortunately, other research shows that when you ask people, name a scientist, they name dead ones. They know about Carl Sagan and they know about Einstein. Nobody knows a scientist. Very few people can say, my next door neighbor is a scientist. The person at my church is a scientist. The person at my exercise facility is a scientist. And as long as there's this, scientists are somebody else. They're not people that we know. They're not people that we trust because we actually don't know them. As long as we have that, we're not going to be able to assuage the concerns that are keeping the fingers in the ears. We have to build up relationships of trust, which requires mutual respect. And mutual respect occurs when people get to know one another as individuals rather than as symbols. If you can establish trustful relationships and assuage the concerns about consequences, then the science has a chance to be listened to, which I think is the goal that all of us would really like to see. If you want more information on this topic, at the National Center for Science Education, if you go to that news alert button over there on the right-hand side of ncsc.com, you can sign up for a free Friday electronic newsletter. It's full of all sorts of depressing information. You can, please do check out our wonderful new blog. We've just started that in the last few weeks. If you go to the news page, you will be taken here where students in the audience, if you need to write a term paper, you can search for states or you can search for a year and get a lot of information. We are a membership organization, so we would obviously appreciate you considering joining us. And we also have a page on climate science, climate change, and this again has ways of sorting through the data. Please do check the climate change button as well. NCSC has a very active YouTube presence, and we have a very active Facebook page. We encourage you to go there as well. We are just down the block in Oakland. We're your neighbors. The staff of the National Center for Science Education includes Glenn Branch, who's the Deputy Director, Robert Lunn, Communications, Peter Hess, Religious Community Outreach, our Phillips Wranglers, Josh Rosenow and Steve Newton. They're the ones who spend a lot of time helping people who elected the wrong school board. Education Director is Eric Mickle. Our two climate change specialists are Mark McCaffrey and Minda Berbecco, and our brand new Executive Director, Ann Reed, who is with me today. Those of you who are students or others who, whatever reason you are on Facebook, if you want to friend me, I'm at eugenie.scott. There are a lot of Eugenie Scott pages out there, but this is the one I actually update. So if you want, for whatever reason, to hear from me, go there. This has been a wonderful privilege to talk to you about ideas that I think are very important, and I hope that you also take seriously the question of denial of science, because it's something that does affect our education system, and ultimately that affects all of us, and not in a good way.
At the end of your presentation, you mentioned that mutual respect was an important way for getting across differences and assuaging people and communicating your point of view. I was hoping you could elaborate a little more on what other methods there are for engaging in mutually respectful debates.
I don't think it's so much a matter of debating, frankly. I think it's more a matter of establishing relationships among people. I have, over the last few decades, have been invited to speak at a lot of free thought and humanist organizations. And about 15 years ago, I told a story about how my daughter at Berkeley High was required by the faculty administrators at Berkeley High to do some sort of community service, which I think is a swell idea. And she chose that she would help load the food on the food trucks. You know, Saturday morning, get up very early, go down to the food bank, and she'd help load the trucks. Good idea. She came back one day and she said, "Mom, all the people down there loading the food truck with me were from a Christian church." And I thought, yeah. So I was at a humanist meeting. This happens to be my particular ideology. And I said, you know, people do not understand non-believers. They do not understand that people who might not believe in God can still be moral and ethical people, still care about their fellow citizens, can be down there at the food truck loading the food on just like you are. And it's establishing relationships where you are viewed as being just like them, as opposed to being a political liberal. My husband, for a number of years, he's born in Berkeley. My daughter's a third generation Berkeley High graduate, so, you know, right on. Yellow jackets or whatever the hell your totem is. But he had a consulting job where he had to work 3 days a week up in the foothills, surrounded by nothing but bright red. I mean, everybody in the little community of Ione, California, I don't think there are 2 Democrats in the whole place. I mean, it's just tiny. And he was a Berkeley liberal. I mean, and they just really did not know how to handle this guy. Well, you know, he started talking about his little girl and, you know, started talking about how concerned he was about his mom and because she was getting sick and all this. And, you know, he ended up being very well loved by the people in that community. They knew he was a Berkeley liberal and probably didn't approve of guns. And he had a number of other shortcomings as well, but he was an okay person. And being an okay person is really what it's all about. Because if you are an okay person as opposed to being a symbol, then you can have a respectful relationship, you can have a trusting relationship. You know, many of us have bemoaned the fact that our society, American society, is so polarized. We seem to be divided into, you know, reds and blues, or capitalists and whatever the non-capitalists are these days. And there seem to be these divisions which seem to be unbroachable. But you know, people over there in the red states, they worry about their kids and they worry about their grandmothers getting sick, and they worry about the same kind of things that people in Berkeley worry about. And there are people in Berkeley who are red. So I think just treating people like human beings and respectfully is a very first step. And don't expect that you're going to change somebody's mind in one pass. This is why I don't think debates are useful. Debates are merely a way of posturing. What you want to do is crack a door just a little bit, get somebody to think about it, and then maybe the next time somebody comes by with the same message, the door gets cracked a little wider.